Welcome to Chronic Health, and in today's video we'll be talking about glycogen. This will be the briefest of overviews of glycogen. If you want to read more about it, I'll link the paper that I'll be referencing in the description below. Now, the most important thing I can say in this video is this right here. Don't form your belief about glycogen because I said it. Form your belief about it because you see it in the research for yourself. Learning to learn for yourself will benefit you far greater than any YouTube video could ever help you. Now, let's get started. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. I like to think of glycogen as a case of water. Glucose is the individual bottles, but glycogen is the case of water. So glycogen is a storage form of glucose. Your body stores glycogen so that it can quickly produce ATP when necessary. ATP is the actual energy that cells use. If you were to start reading about ATP, you'll see the term cell currency used a lot. So to get started, how much do we normally have? Let's go to the paper. In trained and well-fed endurance athletes, muscle glycogen concentration is roughly 150 millimoles per kilogram of wet weight. So that'll be our baseline, our starting point. Whenever we talk about numbers, burning some, gaining some back, just know that the baseline, the starting point, is 155 millimoles. To give you some context on how much is a lot of a loss and how much is a little of a loss, let's go back to the paper. An athlete who begins a hard 2-hour training session with muscle glycogen concentration of 155 millimoles may experience a 50% decline in muscle glycogen, which is close to the theoretical threshold at which muscle function is impaired, making further training or performance difficult. A term you might hear a lot, or the term you might think of whenever you hear threshold, think of hitting the wall. Now, what is it actually used for? Let's go back to the paper. Although muscle and liver glycogen represent just 4% of the body's total fuel stores, muscle glycogen is the primary fuel during exercise of moderate or greater intensity. If you're going for a brisk jog or sprinting, glycogen is going to be your primary fuel source. However, glycogen is not only fuel for the muscles. Quote, under normal circumstances, glucose is the only fuel the brain uses to produce ATP at rest. Approximately 60% of glucose found in the blood is used by the brain. 60%, that is unreal. That is a ton. So it's a major fuel source, but let's dive a little bit deeper. Beginning exercise with ample muscle glycogen stores is an important contributor to improved exercise performance. Further, restoration of glycogen stores is essential for complete recovery and the maintenance of subsequent exercise capacity. Plenty of glycogen helps not only your actual performance, but also recovery and the next day's training as well. The paper goes on to say, if glycogen stored in muscle reach a critically low level, exercise intensity markedly decreases and performance is impaired. It goes back to hitting the wall. Whether you know it or not, when you hit it, you'll feel it. A question I had on my mind when I started reading this paper was, does it help with weight training? Let's go back to the paper. It appears as though low muscle glycogen levels do not impede muscle protein synthesis or the overall anabolic response to resistance training. Now, that is referring to the actual processes that the body goes through to build muscle, not the energy required to physically perform the training needed to cause your body to build muscle. To build muscle, all you need to do is challenge the muscle enough to require your body to build your muscle back stronger. That's what resistance training, that's what working out breaks down to. Earlier in the paper it says, muscle glycogen is an important energy source for resistance training because repeated contractions of near maximal loads stimulate the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, resulting in a reduction of glycogen stores of 25 to 40%. Now, repeated contractions, that's just reps. That's what it's talking about. 25 to 40%, so resistance training can bring you close to that threshold we mentioned earlier. In talking about the threshold, let's refer back to the paper. When muscle glycogen falls to less than 70 millimoles, peak power output is impaired. Now, I interpret that to mean that the internal process of building muscle protein synthesis, is not affected by low muscle glycogen. However, the physical energy required to challenge the muscle to cause it to grow is hindered by low glycogen levels. If you start your training tired and wore out, you're going to hit that wall, you're going to hit that threshold quicker than if you were, well rested, well fed, and ready to go. Now, in total transparency, I feel I should mention this from the paper. There is even less certainty regarding how muscle glycogen stores influence the adaptations associated with resistance training because there are far fewer studies compared to endurance training. Now, one thing is pretty well established is how glycogen affects endurance training, but one thing that is less established is its effect on resistance training. Not to say there's not any, but there's just less. Now let's go over how we actually use it. Another question on my mind when I started reading this paper was, are we always burning it? Is it something that we're always using? Quote, even at rest, each muscle cell contains roughly 1 billion ATP molecules, all of which will be used and replaced every 2 minutes. Now that quote doesn't mention glycogen specifically, but glycogen is one of the fuel sources your body uses to produce ATP. A sentence or two before that in the paper mentions that your body produces ATP via intramuscular glycogen, or the glycogen that's stored in muscles. So I interpret that to mean, yes, you are always burning it, even at rest. Now, you're not burning it a lot, but you're always burning it to some degree. So if we're always burning it, when does glycogen usage really start to ramp up? Let's go back to the paper. During exercise at intensities greater than approximately 60% maximal oxygen consumption, blood glucose and muscle glycogen are the primary fuels oxidized to produce the ATP required to sustain exercise. VO2 max is just a number that represents the amount of oxygen your body can take in and use. Some fuels require oxygen to be made more of. Glucose is one of those fuels. That's why your body stores glycogen, so it can quickly access glucose when it needs the most, like when you're really jogging or really going for a sprint. Now the paper goes on to say, the rate of glycogen degradation depends upon exercise intensity. During all-out exercise, glycogen can release glucose molecules at a rate of 40 millimoles per minute. During low-intensity exercise, glycogen breakdown may occur at only 1 to 2 millimoles of glucose per minute. To some degree, it's always being used. It just depends on the intensity that determines whether a little bit is being used or a lot. Speaking of which, let's talk about replacing glycogen. How do you get it back? By eating, of course, specifically carbs. Let's start with how much to eat. 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight is the current recommendations for the daily carbohydrate intake, which is considered necessary to fully replenish muscle glycogen stores. For example, if you weigh 200 pounds, that's 90 kilograms, you'd eat about 720 to 1,080 carbs a day. Now, when you get into the double digit of carbs, on the 11 or 12s, that's a very high amount of carbs to be eating. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That being said, you do want to stay within that range of 8 to 12 carbs. 24 hours on a high carb diet restored 93% of the muscle glycogen oxidized during a prior 2-hour cycling bout at 65% VO2 max. A low carbohydrate diet restored only 13%. And of course, to me, that makes sense. Eat more carbs, restore more glycogen, right? Now, if you're thinking, I don't eat a lot of carbs, but I still train at a high level and I still feel good when I train. That's how cool the body is. It has been hypothesized that athletes can adapt to lower muscle glycogen stores in ways that protect training capacity and performance. A higher carb diet does seem to be ideal, but even if you eat a moderate amount of carbs, your performance might not even be impacted. However, low carb diets do hurt performance. The same researcher from the quote above went on to say, performance is impaired on low carbohydrate diets. Now this paper goes on to explain how he studied 2 groups of race walkers over a 3-week program. One group had high carb diet, the other group had a low carb diet. And after the program, the higher carb diet increased their performance while the low carb did not. Now it'd be super easy to get into the weeds about specifically how many carbs to eat. It could even be overwhelming. But the part of the paper I think is vital to remember is this. A major factor that influences the rate and extent of glycogen repletion is total calorie intake. Even if adequate amounts of carbohydrates are ingested after exercise, glycogen repletion will not be complete unless sufficient energy intake occurs. Now that tells me to focus on overall calories and not solely just on carbs. Now that we've done some clearing of the weeds, let's jump right back in. Timing. Does timing make a difference? Timing of carbohydrate intake following physical activity is very important during training and competition requiring multiple efforts during a single day. The paper also says, when 24 hours or more are available for glycogen restoration, the frequency of carbohydrate intake is less important than the total amount of carbohydrates and energy consumed. Put simply, if you don't have 24 hours, timing matters. If you do have 24 hours, timing is not as important as overall calorie intake. Now, does carb type matter? If timing can play a factor, then the type of carbs you eat probably does too. Well, let's go back to the paper. Solid and liquid forms of carbohydrates are associated with similar rates of glycogen synthesis. The paper goes on to say that you can meet your carb needs by eating and drinking the foods and drinks you like. Replenishment is going to be similar either way. This could be talking about only the short term. What about the long term? What about longer than 24 hours? Long-term glycogen recovery is not affected by timing or carbohydrate type, but is most influenced by the total amount of carbohydrate ingested. Now it's time to get into the real nitty-gritty. Let's talk about what's optimal. When 24 hours of rest occur between exercise sessions, eating a total of 10 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight, along with enough calories to maintain energy balance, will maximize glycogen restoration. The current recommendation for carb intake is 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. If 10 is good, 12 has to be great, right? Well, consuming greater than 10 carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day appears to be of no additional benefit to glycogen restoration. Now, earlier we read that the current recommendations is 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. Now we're seeing that 10 grams per kilogram is kind of the max, which makes it seem like the paper is contradicting itself, right? Now, this is only my opinion. The paper doesn't explicitly say this, but I'm assuming the recommendations of 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight is taking into account the energy needs of the entire body, not just glycogen replenishment. Earlier, we read that the brain can take upwards of 60% of glucose in the blood, and I know the nervous system can take a lot too, but when we're talking about strictly glycogen replenishment, 10 grams per kilogram seems to be the max. So we've established how many carbs to eat if we have a full day's rest. What if we have multiple sessions or games in a single day? 1.0 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour after exercise stimulates the highest rate of glycogen synthesis. Earlier, the paper says, if a 2-hour bout of exercise reduces muscle glycogen content by 75 millimoles and an athlete has 6 hours of rest prior to the next exercise session, eating 1.0 to 1.2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per hour could theoretically restore 60 millimoles or 80% of the glycogen oxidized. Now, the paper is not saying that 1 to 1.2 grams is going to get you fully restored by the time your next game comes around. However, if you only had a limited amount of time, 1.0 to 1.2 per hour is going to be your best bet to restore as much as you can by the time your next game comes around. Now, of course, when we're talking about what's optimal, the most optimal thing you can do is consume enough calories to maintain energy balance. Next, let's go over some strategies to increase your muscle glycogen stores. Endurance training increases muscle glycogen stores and reduces the reliance on glycogen as a result of the increased use of free fatty acids by active muscle cells. Endurance training can increase your stores and reduces the reliance on glycogen as a whole. The more you use your body, the more efficient it becomes. Something else you can do is techniques such as training with high muscle glycogen stores, but sleeping and then training the next morning with low glycogen stores has been shown in some studies to enhance glycogen storage and performance. Now again, this is purely a guess, but earlier we read that the body can adapt to lower glycogen stores and still perform well. I think that the workout with high glycogen, sleep, workout again with low glycogen is just training your body to work more efficiently and using less glycogen as a result. Again, it's just my opinion. Lastly, let's review some key points from this paper. Number 1, current recommendations are 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. 2, Solid and liquid carbs will give similar glycogen replenishing effects. 3. A major factor in glycogen replenishment, possibly the majorest of factors, is total calorie intake. I bring up these 3 specifically because I wanted to try and simplify an easily overcomplicated subject. Don't obsess over carbs. There are multiple different factors that go into a single concept like exercise performance than just carbohydrates. It's an important factor, but don't think it's solely the only one you need to focus on. Now, there's much more in this paper that I didn't go over, stuff like supercompensation or even how protein can affect glycogen. Like I said at the beginning, and I want to reiterate it right here, read the paper for yourself. Again, don't form your belief on glycogen because I said it. Believe it because you see it in the research for yourself. Thank you for watching my video. If you'd like to watch another one, you can click right here. The link to the research paper that I was quoting from in this video will be in the description below. Again, follow that link, read the paper for yourself, form your own opinions, because in context, you might not even have the same opinions that I drew. So go read the paper, learn to learn for yourself. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.